There are stories the Pacific Theater never fully documented, not because they lacked witnesses, but because those who survived them preferred silence over medals. In late August 1944, Corporal James Theodore Harlan, a 28-year-old deer hunter from the mountains of West Virginia, transmitted his final coherent radio message from a reconnaissance position deep in the Philippine jungle. His voice, crackling through static and monsoon interference, reported enemy movement along a supply route near the Cagayan Valley. Then the transmission cut. For the next 43 days, the United States Army listed him as missing in action, presumed dead. His wife Eleanor received the standard condolence letter. His hunting rifle, a Winchester Model 70 he'd carried since he was 16, remained catalogued in his personal effects back at base camp. But James Harlan was not dead. He was adapting. The reconnaissance unit he'd been attached to, a mixed squad of infantry and scouts tasked with mapping enemy logistics routes, had been ambushed during a dawn patrol. The attack came without warning. Mortars first, then small arms fire from concealed positions along both flanks. Harlan had been 20 meters ahead, marking coordinates on his field map, when the first shells impacted. He heard the screams, saw the muzzle flashes, felt the jungle floor shudder beneath his boots. Training told him to fall back and regroup. Instinct told him the regiment was gone. He chose instinct. He moved east, deeper into the unmapped sections where American forces rarely ventured and Japanese patrols operated with impunity. He carried his M1 Garand, 4 magazines, a canteen half full, a combat knife and a waterproof pouch containing matches, fishhooks and a compass. He also carried something the Army had not issued him: 22 years of hunting experience in terrain that demanded patience, silence, and the ability to read what the forest was trying to say. The first 3 days were survival in its rawest form. Harlan moved only at dusk and dawn, using the low light to mask his silhouette. He drank from streams, boiled water when he could risk a fire, and ate nothing but what he foraged: roots, insects, the occasional lizard roasted over coals he buried immediately after use. He avoided trails. He avoided clearings. He avoided anything that suggested human passage. The jungle was not empty. He heard voices, Japanese voices, calling to one another in the distance, the metallic clink of equipment, the idling of truck engines on hidden roads. He observed their patterns. He noted their schedules, and slowly, methodically, he began to understand that he was not hiding in their territory. They were moving through his. On the 4th night, crouched beneath a fallen mahogany tree, Harlan made a decision that would define the next 6 weeks of his life. He would not wait for rescue. He would not attempt to reach friendly lines through 70 miles of occupied jungle. He would hunt, not for food, not for survival. But because hunting was the only language he spoke fluently in a war that had stripped him of everything else, his unit, his orders, his connection to command, the deer he'd tracked through the Appalachian winters had taught him that the pursued and the pursuer exist in a state of constant negotiation. The jungle, he realized, was no different. Except here, both sides carried rifles. By the end of the first week, Harlan had constructed a mental map of enemy activity within a 4-square-mile radius. He identified 3 supply routes, 2 semi-permanent encampments, and a listening post positioned on a ridge overlooking a river crossing. He studied the rotation schedules of sentries. He noted which soldiers smoked, which ones talked too much, which ones wandered away from their posts to relieve themselves in the bushes. He learned their vulnerabilities not through interrogation or intelligence reports, but through observation, the same way he'd learned to predict where a buck would bed down by reading the terrain and the weather. And when he was certain he understood their routines, he began to disrupt them. The first kill happened on the 9th day. A lone Japanese soldier, separated from his patrol, squatted beside a stream to refill his canteen. Harlan watched him for 11 minutes from a position 30 meters upslope, concealed behind a tangle of vines and rotting logs. He did not feel anger. He did not feel fear. He felt the same cold calculation he'd felt 100 times before, waiting for a whitetail to step into the open. When the soldier stood and turned his back, Harlan fired once. The M1's report echoed through the canopy, and before the body hit the water, Harlan was already moving, retracing a path he'd memorized 2 days earlier. He did not return to confirm the kill. He did not take trophies. He simply vanished back into the green silence, knowing that somewhere behind him, confusion was spreading like smoke. The jungle does not forgive mistakes, and James Harlan understood this with the clarity of someone who had spent his youth learning that nature operates without mercy or sentiment. By the second week of his isolation, he had refined his routine into a series of disciplined rituals that governed every waking hour. He rose before dawn, moving in the pre-light darkness, when shadows still clung to the undergrowth, and visibility was reduced to shapes rather than details. He ate sparingly, wild yams, palm hearts, anything that required no fire and left no scent. He cleaned his rifle daily, using strips torn from his undershirt and rainwater collected in a folded leaf. He spoke to no one, not even himself, understanding that the human voice, once unleashed, becomes a beacon in a silence that listens. After the first ambush, the successful one, the one that left a Japanese soldier face down in a stream with a single bullet wound between his shoulder blades, Harlan had expected retaliation. Search parties, sweeps, helicopters, if they had them in this sector. Instead, there was confusion. He watched from concealment as patrols doubled, then tripled, moving in tight formations that sacrificed stealth for security. They swept the area where the soldier had died, found his body, evacuated it. But they did not find Harlan. They did not even come close, because Harlan was not hiding in the sense they understood. He was hunting, and hunters do not remain static. They orbit their prey, always moving, always calculating, always 3 steps ahead of the pattern. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. He began to vary his tactics. The second engagement occurred 4 days after the first, on a narrow trail used by supply carriers moving between 2 encampments. Harlan had spent 2 full days observing the route, noting that the carriers traveled in groups of 3, always in late afternoon when the heat made them careless. He positioned himself on an elevated ridge overlooking a choke point where the trail narrowed between 2 massive root systems. He did not aim for the lead carrier or the rear guard. He aimed for the one in the middle, the one whose death would create maximum panic without providing an immediate target for return fire. The shot was clean, the carrier collapsed. The other 2 scattered into the undergrowth, screaming. Harlan was already gone, moving perpendicular to the trail, using the chaos to mask his withdrawal. What disturbed him was not the act of killing, but the efficiency with which he had adapted to it. In West Virginia, he had hunted to eat, to provide, to participate in a tradition that connected him to his father and his grandfather before him. There had been reverence in it, a respect for the animal, a gratitude for the meat. Here, there was only mathematics, distance, wind speed, angle of descent. The rifle did not distinguish between deer and men, and Harlan found himself wondering during the long nights when sleep was impossible and the rain drummed against the leaves above him, whether he had become something other than a soldier, not a warrior, not a killer, but a function, a variable in an equation the jungle itself was solving. By the 3rd week, the Japanese patrols had changed their behavior entirely. They no longer moved in predictable patterns. They varied their routes. They posted additional sentries. They traveled in larger groups, sacrificing speed for numbers. Harlan recognized the shift immediately. They were not hunting him because they did not believe he existed. They were reacting to a ghost, a phantom disruption they could not identify, locate, or eliminate. The frustration, he knew, was spreading through their ranks like fever. He could see it in the way they argued at rest stops, the way officers berated subordinates, the way they fired blindly into the jungle at sounds that might have been wind or might have been movement. Fear, Harlan understood, was a force multiplier, and he was deploying it with the precision of an artillery strike. But fear worked both ways. On the 21st day, crouched in a blind he'd constructed from palm fronds and mud, Harlan watched a Japanese squad execute a local villager accused of aiding American forces. They did it methodically, without ceremony, in a clearing visible from 3 directions. The message was clear: collaboration would be punished, silence would be rewarded. Harlan did not intervene. He could not. Any action would reveal his position, compromise his survival, and ultimately accomplish nothing beyond his own death. So he remained motionless, watching through the scope of his rifle as the body was left in the clearing as a warning. And when the squad departed, he remained in position for another 2 hours, ensuring they had truly gone, before slipping back into the jungle with a weight in his chest that no amount of training had prepared him to carry. That night, for the first time since the ambush, Harlan allowed himself to think about Eleanor, about the letters he would never be able to send, about the explanations he would never be able to give, about the man he had been before the jungle and the man he was becoming within it. The transformation was not dramatic. It was incremental, measured in heartbeats and bullet casings and nights spent listening to the forest breathe. He was still James Harlan, but he was also something the army had never intended to create. A man who had learned to survive by becoming indistinguishable from the violence around him. There is a language spoken between predator and prey that exists entirely outside words. A dialogue of movement, positioning, and intent that unfolds across landscapes with surgical precision. James Harlan had learned this language as a boy, tracking wounded elk through snow that erased all sound except the rhythm of his own breathing. Now, in the suffocating humidity of the Philippine jungle, he applied those lessons to human targets with a discipline that bordered on scientific. By the 4th week of his isolation, he had eliminated 7 Japanese soldiers. Not in firefights, not in ambushes that involved chaos or confusion, but in singular, calculated engagements that left the enemy's command structure grasping at explanations that did not exist. He was not a sniper in the conventional sense. He had no spotter, no fallback position, no radio contact with command. He was a hunter who had recognized that war, at its most fundamental level, was an ecological system. And in that system, he had identified his niche. The jungle itself became his primary weapon. Harlan had spent the first 2 weeks mapping terrain features with obsessive detail, not with paper and pencil, which would have been useless in the constant rain, but with memory. He catalogued ridgelines, creek beds, game trails, and the massive root systems of strangler figs that created natural blinds. He noted which areas flooded during afternoon storms, which hillsides offered concealment without restricting movement, which trees produced fruit that attracted both wildlife and enemy foragers. He learned to distinguish between the sound of rain dripping from leaves and the sound of equipment brushing against vegetation. He could identify Japanese voices by cadence and tone, even when the words themselves were unintelligible. And most critically, he learned to predict where the enemy would be vulnerable, not through intelligence reports or reconnaissance photos, but by understanding the same principles that governed animal behavior. Water sources, food sources, routes of least resistance. His 3rd kill occurred at a natural spring where Japanese soldiers routinely refilled canteens during midday patrols. Harlan had observed the location for 5 consecutive days, noting that the soldiers always approached from the north, always posted a single sentry facing the trail, and always spent between 3 and 7 minutes at the spring before moving on. On the 6th day, he positioned himself 80 meters southeast, elevated on a moss-covered boulder that provided clear sight lines while remaining invisible from the trail. When the patrol arrived, 4 soldiers, 1 sentry, Harlan waited until all 4 had removed their helmets and bent toward the water. He did not aim for the sentry. He aimed for the soldier farthest from cover, the one whose death would force the others to cross open ground to reach concealment. The bullet entered just below the collarbone. The soldier collapsed into the spring, staining it red. The others scattered. Harlan was already descending the far side of the boulder, moving through a ravine he'd scouted 3 days earlier, putting 200 meters between himself and the kill site before the first return shots were fired. What unnerved him was not the killing itself, but the realization that he had begun to think of the enemy not as soldiers, but as patterns, behavioral algorithms that could be studied, predicted, and exploited. He did not hate them. He did not dehumanize them in the way propaganda posters back home suggested he should. He simply understood them as he understood white-tailed deer, creatures of habit, governed by instinct and routine, vulnerable at the moments when those routines intersected with necessity: water, food, rest. These were the pressure points, and Harlan applied pressure with the methodical patience of someone who had spent years waiting for the perfect shot. By late September, the Japanese command had begun to interpret the attacks as the work of a small guerrilla cell operating with local support. Harlan knew this because he had observed their response: increased patrols in villages, interrogations of civilians, and a general tightening of movement restrictions that suggested they believed the threat was organized rather than individual. The misunderstanding worked in his favor. They were searching for a network. They were deploying resources to uncover supply lines, safe houses, collaborators. They were not searching for a lone American corporal who had learned to live on less than 1,000 calories a day and sleep in 2-hour increments beneath the exposed roots of banyan trees. Their inability to conceptualize him as a singular threat was, paradoxically, his greatest protection. But isolation extracts a cost that cannot be measured in casualties or tactical victories. Harlan had stopped counting days. The calendar had become irrelevant in a landscape where time was marked only by the monsoon's rhythm and the slow degradation of his uniform. His boots were disintegrating, held together with strips of vine and improvised stitching. His socks had rotted away entirely. His hands, once calloused from years of farm work and rifle handling, had developed a different texture: harder, scarred, perpetually damp. He had lost weight, though he could not say how much. His face, when he glimpsed it reflected in still water, belonged to someone else, hollow-cheeked, eyes that scanned constantly, even in moments of rest. A stranger who wore his name but operated according to principles he had never consciously chosen. On the 31st day, Harlan killed 2 soldiers in a single engagement, a deviation from his established pattern of singular, spaced-out attacks. It happened at dusk, along a trail he had been monitoring for over a week. The soldiers were moving together, perhaps 5 meters apart, speaking in low voices. One of them was limping. Harlan had not planned a double engagement. His doctrine, developed through trial and error, dictated 1 shot, 1 withdrawal, maximum confusion. But the tactical opportunity was undeniable. The trail passed through a narrow corridor between 2 dense thickets. The soldiers were fatigued, distracted. The wind was blowing east, carrying sound away from his position. He fired twice in 4 seconds, chest shots, both clean, and was moving before either body hit the ground. The efficiency disturbed him, not because it was difficult, but because it had become routine. That night, sheltered beneath an overhang of limestone that kept the rain off his face, Harlan thought about Eleanor's hands, the way she'd held his face the morning he shipped out, fingers cool against his temples, eyes searching his as though trying to memorize something she feared she'd lose. He wondered what she'd been told. Missing in action, probably. Not dead, not yet. Just absent, suspended in bureaucratic limbo where grief could not fully settle because hope, however thin, remained. He wondered if she still checked the mailbox, if she still set a place for him at the table out of habit, if she dreamed about him, and if those dreams felt true or felt like memory, slowly corroding into fiction. He wondered if, when he finally returned, if he returned, she would recognize the man who came back, or if the jungle would follow him home, encoded in reflexes and silences she could never fully understand. There is a moment in every extended hunt when the line between pursuit and obsession dissolves, and the hunter must confront a question that has no comfortable answer. What am I becoming? James Harlan reached that threshold on the 37th day of his isolation, not during an engagement or in the aftermath of a kill, but in the pre-dawn silence when the jungle held its breath between night and morning. He had just completed a 4-hour surveillance session, watching a Japanese supply depot from a concealed position 300 meters distant. He had counted personnel, noted shift changes, memorized the layout of tents, equipment caches, and defensive positions. And as the first pale light filtered through the canopy, he realized he had been planning an attack, not a survival measure, not a tactical necessity, but an assault driven by something darker and more complicated than duty. He had been planning it because the hunt had become its own justification, because inaction felt like failure, because somewhere in the accumulated weeks of isolation and violence, he had stopped thinking about escape and started thinking only about the next target. The depot was too large. Even under optimal conditions, surprise, darkness, multiple exit routes, the risk far outweighed any strategic gain. Harlan had no mission to disrupt enemy supply lines. He had no orders to inflict maximum damage. He was not operating as part of a coordinated military effort. He was one man with a rifle and 17 rounds of ammunition, and attacking a fortified position would accomplish nothing except his own death. Yet he had spent hours mapping approaches, identifying weak points, calculating fields of fire. The planning had been automatic, reflexive, divorced from rational analysis. And that realization, that he had been moments away from crossing a line from which there would be no return, forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding since the first kill. He was no longer fighting for survival. He was fighting because the structure of war had given purpose to skills that had no other outlet. In West Virginia, those skills had been contained within rituals that acknowledged their weight. The hunt was never casual. It began with preparation, checking equipment, reading weather, studying maps, and ended with gratitude. Every deer Harlan had ever killed had been processed with care, the meat distributed among family and neighbors, the act embedded in a framework of utility and respect. Here, there was no framework. There was only the rifle and the target, and the space between them, repeated in variations that no longer carried meaning beyond their own execution. He had become efficient. And efficiency, he was beginning to understand, was not the same as morality. If this story has surprised you, go ahead and leave a like to help the channel. For 3 full days, Harlan did not fire his weapon. He remained in motion, circling the area he had been operating in, but avoided contact entirely. It was not cowardice, it was recalibration, an attempt to re-establish the boundary between necessity and compulsion. He focused on survival in its most basic form: water, shelter, calories. He repaired his clothing using fibers stripped from palm fronds. He cleaned his rifle for the 3rd time that week, not because it needed cleaning, but because the ritual imposed order on chaos. He allowed himself to sleep for more than 2 hours at a stretch, trusting the jungle's acoustics to wake him if danger approached. And in those moments of stillness, he permitted himself to think about questions he had been suppressing since the ambush. What was the larger war doing while he played hunter in this forgotten corner of it? Had his unit been replaced? Had the front lines moved? Was the campaign even still being fought in this sector, or had strategic priorities shifted, leaving him to wage a private conflict that no longer served any purpose beyond his own survival? On the 40th day, he encountered Civilians for the first time since going to ground. A family, 2 adults, 3 children, moving through the jungle with the careful silence of people who had learned that visibility meant danger. Harlan watched them from concealment, his rifle resting across his knees, safety on. They were heading west, away from Japanese-controlled areas, carrying bundles wrapped in banana leaves. The children were barefoot. The adults moved with the exhaustion of people who had been displaced too many times to count. Harlan could have revealed himself, could have asked for information, for food, for guidance toward American lines, but he did not, because revealing himself would place them in danger, because his presence had already brought violence to this region, and involving civilians would only multiply the consequences. Because he understood, with cold clarity, that he had become a liability to anyone who acknowledged his existence. When they had passed out of sight, Harlan remained motionless for another hour, listening to the jungle return to its baseline hum of insects and distant bird calls. He thought about the children's faces, thin, wary, old before their time. He thought about the arbitrariness of survival, the randomness that had placed him in the jungle with a rifle while they fled with nothing but what they could carry. He thought about the letters Eleanor used to write him during basic training, letters that talked about the garden she was planting, the neighborhood kids who played stickball in the street, the mundane details of a life that now seemed impossibly distant. And he understood that the jungle had not changed him so much as revealed something that had always been present, a capacity for detachment, for focus, for the kind of cold pragmatism that allowed a man to kill without emotion and justify it as necessity. The 42nd day brought rain that lasted 16 hours without pause, turning the jungle floor into a maze of ankle-deep mud and rising water. Harlan took shelter in a hollow tree, wedging himself into the cavity with his rifle cradled against his chest, listening to the deluge batter the canopy above. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He simply existed in the space between consciousness and stupor, his body conserving energy while his mind drifted across memories that felt more like artifacts than experiences. The day he'd met Eleanor at a church social, the first deer he'd ever shot with his father, the sound his mother made when she laughed, a sound he realized he could no longer accurately recall. War, he understood, was not just the destruction of the present. It was the erosion of the past, the slow dissolution of the person you had been, replaced by the person circumstances demanded you become. When the rain finally stopped and the jungle returned to its oppressive stillness, Harlan emerged from the tree and made a decision. He would attempt to reach American lines. Not because he had accomplished any meaningful military objective, not because he believed his survival served a larger purpose, but because remaining in the jungle meant surrendering entirely to the logic of the hunt, and he could feel that logic tightening around him like a noose. He checked his compass, oriented himself southwest, and began moving through terrain he had not yet mapped, toward a destination he could only approximate, carrying the weight of 7 weeks and 9 kills, and the knowledge that the man who eventually reached safety, if he reached it at all, would not be the same man who had transmitted that final radio message on a humid August morning that now felt like it had occurred in someone else's life. Navigation without landmarks is an exercise in faith, and James Harlan had learned during his isolation that faith operates on a currency entirely separate from certainty. By the 45th day, moving southwest through terrain that grew progressively denser and more treacherous, he had begun to question whether American lines still existed in any location he could reasonably reach. The jungle had become a labyrinth without exit, each mile identical to the last, tangled undergrowth, oppressive humidity, the constant buzz of insects that fed on him during movement and rest alike. His uniform, what remained of it, clung to him like a second skin, rotting from sweat and rain. His ammunition had dwindled to 11 rounds. The knife he carried was dull from field use. And the compass, his only connection to direction and purpose, had developed a hairline crack across its face that made him wonder how long before it failed entirely. He had not fired his weapon in 8 days. The decision to move rather than hunt had imposed a different discipline, one that required him to avoid contact entirely, to prioritize stealth over engagement, to become invisible rather than effective. It was harder than killing. Killing, he had discovered, provided structure. It gave shape to the hours. It offered measurable outcomes. Movement without conflict was just endurance, and endurance without a visible endpoint felt like submission to entropy. He marked progress by streams crossed, ridges climbed, nights survived. But the numbers meant nothing. He could be 20 miles from friendly territory or 70. The jungle gave no indication. It simply continued, indifferent to his presence, absorbing his efforts the way it absorbed rain, completely without acknowledgement. On the 47th day, he found evidence of recent American activity. A discarded ration tin, rusted but not ancient, half buried in mud near a game trail. Harlan examined it with the intensity of an archaeologist studying a relic. The label was faded but readable. U.S. Army canned hash, packed 1943. It meant nothing definitive. It could have been dropped months ago by a patrol that never returned. It could have been carried here by floodwaters from a distant base. But it suggested proximity, and proximity was the only currency that mattered. He adjusted his bearing, angling more aggressively southwest, pushing through fatigue that had become so constant he no longer registered it as distinct from consciousness. His body had learned to operate in a state of perpetual depletion, rationing energy with the efficiency of a machine that knows it cannot afford to stop. 2 days later, he heard artillery, distant, muffled by miles of jungle and hills, but unmistakable. The low crump of heavy guns, the kind of sustained bombardment that signaled active operations. Harlan stopped moving and simply listened, triangulating direction and distance with the instinct of someone who had spent weeks learning to interpret every sound the jungle produced. The shelling was southwest, perhaps 15 miles, maybe more. It meant American or Allied forces were engaged. It meant the war had not moved on. It meant, most critically, that he had a direction worth pursuing, even if it killed him to reach it. He checked his remaining ammunition, 11 rounds, and began moving toward the sound of violence with the determination of someone who understood that salvation and destruction often arrived wearing the same face. The jungle began to change, subtly at first, then unmistakably. The undergrowth thinned, the canopy opened. He started encountering trails that showed signs of recent use, boot prints, crushed vegetation, the faint chemical smell of diesel fuel. He moved with extreme caution now, avoiding the trails themselves, paralleling them from concealment, understanding that proximity to civilization meant proximity to danger. He could encounter Japanese patrols. He could stumble into a minefield. He could be shot by his own forces who had no reason to expect a lone American wandering out of territory that had been written off weeks ago. The possibility of dying within sight of rescue was statistically higher than any danger he had faced in the deep jungle, and the irony was not lost on him. On the 51st day, he saw them. American soldiers, a full platoon, moving in formation along a muddy road that had been invisible from the jungle, but now stretched before him like a promise. Harlan did not immediately reveal himself. He watched from the tree line, confirming uniforms, weapons, insignia. He studied their movements for signs of discipline and cohesion. He listened to their voices, ensuring the language was English, the accents familiar. Only when he was certain, absolutely certain, did he step into the open, hands raised, rifle held above his head in a gesture of surrender that felt more like resurrection. The soldiers saw him. Rifles swung in his direction. Commands were shouted. And in the moment before they recognized him as American rather than threat, Harlan understood that the hardest part of survival was not staying alive. It was convincing others that you deserved to return. The debriefing took place in a tent that smelled of canvas and disinfectant, presided over by a captain whose face carried the particular exhaustion of someone managing a war that refused to follow doctrine. James Theodore Harlan sat across from him on a folding chair, wearing borrowed fatigues 2 sizes too large, his own uniform having been incinerated as a biohazard. They had fed him, slowly, cautiously, small portions that would not shock a system accustomed to starvation. They had examined him, cataloguing wounds, infections, the muscle loss that left him 28 pounds lighter than his service record indicated. They had given him water, morphine for pain he had stopped registering as distinct from existence, and a space to sleep under guard, not because they suspected him of anything, but because soldiers who return from the dead require observation before reintegration. The captain asked questions with the precision of someone following a checklist: unit designation, last known position, circumstances of separation. Harlan answered mechanically, providing coordinates and dates and tactical details. He described the ambush, the decision to move east, the initial weeks of evasion. But when the captain asked about enemy contact, specifically whether Harlan had observed or engaged Japanese forces during his isolation, something tightened in his chest. He had known this question was coming, had rehearsed answers during the 3-day march back to base. But sitting across from an officer whose war was measured in reports and radio communications, Harlan found himself unable to articulate the calculus that had governed his survival. "I engaged when necessary," he said finally, "for self-defense and tactical disruption." The captain made a note. "How many enemy casualties would you estimate?" Harlan did not hesitate. 9 confirmed, possibly 2 additional, unconfirmed. The number hung in the air between them. The captain looked up from his notepad, studying Harlan with an expression that might have been respect or might have been something more complicated. 9 confirmed kills, operating alone, over 7 weeks. It was not a question. It was verification. Harlan nodded. The captain resumed writing. The interview continued for another 40 minutes, covering logistics and terrain and the locations of Japanese positions Harlan had observed. But the core of what had happened in the jungle, the transformation, the moral erosion, the way hunting had become indistinguishable from existence, remained unspoken because there was no vocabulary in military debriefings for that kind of honesty. They recommended him for a commendation. "Bronze Star with valor," the captain said, "for actions above and beyond the call of duty." Harlan accepted the news without comment. Medals, he understood, were how the army translated chaos into narrative, horror into heroism, survival into strategy. They needed him to be a symbol, the lone soldier who refused to quit, who turned isolation into tactical advantage, who proved that training and determination could overcome impossible odds. And he would play that role because playing it meant he could go home. But he knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent 53 days listening to the jungle breathe, that the man they were commending was not the man sitting in this tent. That man was still out there, orbiting supply routes and listening for the sound of enemy voices, because the jungle does not release its inhabitants, it only pauses them. Eleanor was waiting in West Virginia. The telegram had reached her 4 days after his recovery. Missing status revised to safe, returning home, details to follow. Harlan tried to imagine the moment she received it, tried to imagine her hands shaking as she read the words, tried to imagine her relief, her joy, the questions she would have that he could never fully answer, but the imagination failed. The version of Eleanor he carried in his memory belonged to a world that felt fictional now. A place where gardens grew and children played stickball, and war was something that happened elsewhere to other people. He had left that world 53 days ago. He had not returned to it. and he suspected with a dread that lived somewhere beneath exhaustion that he never would. The transport back to the States took 11 days. Shipped to Pearl Harbor to San Francisco to Charleston by rail. Harlan spent most of the journey in silence, watching landscapes scroll past windows, surrounded by other soldiers who laughed and played cards and talked about what they would do first when they got home. He did not join them. He could not explain why. But proximity to celebration felt like trespassing, and so he kept his distance, polite but disengaged, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. At night, when the train rattled through darkness and the other men slept, Harlan remained awake, staring at his reflection in the black glass, seeing a face he still did not fully recognize. West Virginia in October was a riot of color, maples turning red, oaks fading to amber, the mountains layered in shades of rust and gold. Eleanor met him at the station, and when she saw him, her face went through emotions too fast to name. She ran to him, wrapped her arms around him, held him as though afraid he might dissolve. And Harlan held her back, feeling the warmth of her body, smelling the soap she used, hearing her voice say his name over and over like a prayer. But beneath the relief and the gratitude and the overwhelming physical reality of being home, he felt the distance, the gulf between the man she was holding and the man she remembered. She felt it too. He could see it in the way she pulled back, searching his face, trying to find the person she had said goodbye to 9 months earlier. They did not talk about the jungle. Not that day, not that week, not in the months that followed. Harlan returned to routines, working the farm, attending church, sitting on the porch in the evenings while Eleanor read beside him. But the routines were performative, a script he followed because deviation would raise questions he could not answer. At night, he dreamed of the jungle. Not nightmares exactly, just the jungle, its sounds, its smells, the weight of the rifle across his knees, the moment before a shot when everything balanced on the edge of decision. He would wake in darkness, disoriented, reaching for a weapon that was not there, and Eleanor would place her hand on his chest, grounding him, saying nothing because what could be said? Years later, when journalists asked about his time in the Pacific, Harlan would describe it in the language the army had given him: survival, determination, duty. He would not mention the way the jungle had taught him that morality was a luxury afforded to people who did not have to choose between killing and dying. He would not mention the children he had watched flee through the undergrowth, or the way he had planned an assault on a supply depot for no reason, except that planning it made him feel purposeful. He would not mention that for 53 days he had been the most dangerous thing in a jungle full of dangers, and that some part of him, the part Eleanor could not reach, the part that woke him in darkness, missed it. The war ended. He received his medal in a ceremony that felt like theater. He grew old, and when he died, decades later, surrounded by family who loved him, the obituary would call him a hero. It would not mention that heroism and horror are often indistinguishable, that the jungle never fully releases those who learn its language, that the man who survived was not the same man who returned. These truths, like so many from that war, remained buried beneath silence, not because they were forgotten, but because no words existed to carry their weight. The jungle remembers, it always does. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of James Theodore Harlan. See you in the next video.